time. And if anyone is joining us, then they can join us in the introduction. And if not, they will listen to this or watch this conversation later on YouTube, because from this meeting we decided that we will be recording the meetings and upload them online, because at least the lecture part is very interesting for everyone and not just for the network. So we will try to make it accessible. And our guest today has agreed to this. So just to ensure that everyone is aware. So if you don't want to have your face recorded, don't turn on your camera while the lecture is ongoing. Afterwards, you can just switch the camera on, because we will stop the recording at the end of the lecture. So, welcome, Sigurður Gylfi Magnússon. You're professor of cultural history at the University of Iceland, and I must say that Sigurður and I had a very nice conversation for my podcast, which will be out on the 15th of January. So if you want to know a lot more about his career, you can listen to the podcast. And otherwise, he will tell you about his academic endeavors now himself. And I will just read out the title of today's seminar: The Cultural Existence of Few Barefoot Historians in the Icelandic Peasant Society in the 19th Century, Biography, Egodocuments, and Microhistory. So welcome, Sigurður, and I'm very happy that you agreed on a rather short notice to join us.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be part of the network. I just recently signed in. And I'm looking forward to give the presentation and have some discussions about my stuff. Barefoot historian is maybe a concept few people actually know, and I will explain it a little later. But it is more or less about scribes, popular scribes in the 19th century Icelandic society. I will mostly been dealing with Egodocuments and microhistory, and but first, I'm going to introduce myself very briefly. Let me see. I need to. My scholarly autobiography, so to speak. I am Icelandic. I got my education, undergraduate education, here at the University of Iceland. I went then for my graduate education in America. I stayed there for almost 10 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and got my doctoral degree at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. When I moved back, I became the chairperson of the Icelandic Historical Association, and later, in the end of the 20th century, a group of independent scholars formed a research institute which was called the Reykjavik Academy, and I was the first chairperson of that institute. We started 10 of us out at the beginning. After a year and a half, we were 40 of us there. And when I left 12 years later, approximately 600 people had passed through the Reykjavik Academy in a shorter or longer time. So it became a very vibrant scholarly institute. People from the humanities and the social sciences, and we had one thing in common: we didn't really have a job. We were independent scholars, and we lived on soft monies. So it was a very unusual time, and the University of Iceland wasn't hiring anyone. People were flocking from other countries. These were people who got their education in Scandinavia, in Germany, in France, in England, and in America, like myself. And most of us had a PhD degree in history, literature, or whatever, in the humanities and the social sciences. And these are my publications. I am author of approximately 30 books. A lot of them deal with Egodocuments, everyday life history, and microhistory. I am an editor of two book series, one in Icelandic, which is called Sýnisbók íslenskrar alþýðumenningar, which is in English Anthology of Icelandic Popular Culture. And within few months, we are going to be publishing book number 35. So we started in 1997. So we have been quite busy publishing Egodocuments with a substantive introduction about each document. I'm going to be talking about book number 1, the first book, and also book number 17 in this presentation. I am also a co-editor of a Routledge book series, which is called the Microhistories. We started, our first book came out in the end of year 2018 with my friend and fellow colleague Istvan M. Siarto, Hungarian microhistorian. And we are now preparing book number 22, 23 this year. If you have any manuscript you think would fit into our book series, by all means let me know, and we will take a close look at it. The good thing is it's a very interesting, I would argue it's a very interesting book series because we are including books from all over the world, so to speak. So you get a good feeling what microhistory is all about. But today I'm going to start with the first barefoot historian I'm going to be talking about, Jón the farmer, Jón Bjarnason, who was born 1791 in the northern northern part of Iceland. A person with absolutely no education, so to speak. His parents were poor to begin with. They kind of rose up in the social ladder, but they didn't really want to educate their son. He had very great interest in reading and writing, mathematics and astronomy. He was a very unusual guy. He was greatly influenced by a friend of his from the same commune, Björn Gunnlaugsson, who later became the head teacher at the only Latin school in Reykjavik, and they were pen pals for decades. So he wrote over 400 manuscripts, including material on religion, natural sciences, and all kinds of stuff. And he apparently understood Danish, Icelandic, of course, Danish, German, and English. His big major achievement was the encyclopedia, which he wrote 1845 to 1852, 9 volumes. And the extraordinary thing about this is that one of the volumes, or volume number 3, is 500 drawings of concepts from the fauna and the flora, all kinds of animals and plants. Yeah, it's a handwritten, of course, created from different published sources, German, Danish, English, and Icelandic, and also oral sources. It deals with the creation of the world and the development of the species, and you can sense a certain conflict between sciences and religion and superstition. He was a religious man, even though he was, you could tell that the Enlightenment was rippling down to the Icelandic general public in the latter part of the 19th century. And it's quite remarkable how he structured the book, how he talks about, for example, the development of the species, for example, the human race. He divides the human race into, I think, if I remember right, 6 categories. And I'm going to give you a taste of how he deals, for example, with Black people. You have to pardon the language here. I'm going to read it. These are, it says there on the illustration, Southern world people, blue people, sometimes called Negroes. And here is the text. I'm going to read part of it. Negroes have in general black, smooth, soft skin and short hair, which is as soft as down. The beard is like the hair, yet it turns gray at an early age, while the hair very rarely does so. Thus, there are many who are white-bearded and black-haired at the same time. Their teeth are as white as ivory, and the white colors contrast sharply with the black skin. But it is not only in their facial features that most of them are ugly. The breasts of the women who have had children hang down to the navel, and they inevitably suck the children's they carry on their backs by flinging their breast back on their shoulders. And in the next, I continue here, but regardless of how senseless, unintelligent, and uncultivated the people were, maybe, it appears that those Christian people of the North have little reason to regard themselves as better than them, who every year buy and sell many thousands Negroes into lifelong servitude, subject to the most godless treatment, as if they were beasts to the slaughter or inanimated objects, alas, at such deeds that bring shame on all mankind, any humanitarian must shoulder. So it's an interesting, of course, we would call it a very racist statement about the black people in the world, but at the same time, he kind of sends white people who are at top of the pyramid, he gives them a piece of his mind. So he goes through all the races like this, explains what their characteristics are, and the white people are on the top. He's very interested in giants and dwarves, and you can see this figure there. He takes this from a book from 1688, published in Iceland, the Book of Settlement, and just compare it here. He gives it his own kind of flavor, but it is the same, basically the same drawing. Odd-looking people, vampires, and of course, scorpion, a bull, a kangaroo, and this is probably the first time Icelanders saw a kangaroo. This drawing is just like a Icelandic kangaroo. It's a combination of kind of a horse head or a rat or maybe a sheep, but after you can see it from the text there that he is referring to a specific book which I tried to locate here in Iceland, and I found it actually in the library of the Latin school, and here it is. It's a Danish book which was published right before he started on his encyclopedia. He started on it at 1845, and this book was published 1844, and it was found in the Latin school, and he probably got his hands on it. And here we see more. Here is bats, and you see how they structure it, and he refers to the drawings into the text in the encyclopedia itself. And monsters, he was really into monsters, and he makes the claim that he never ever talks about monster where if he didn't really have a confirmed testimony that they did exist. So it was a superstition slash education which characterizes this monsters with many heads and wings, kind of interesting drawings. And we published it. I published it with my student Árni Kristjánsson in this book, which was the book number 17 in our book series. So the question is, how can we explain Jón the Farmer and the other barefoot historians? And again, when I talk about barefoot historians, they are people who were kind of in between spaces. I mean, they were not educated and they were not part of the popular culture. They formed their deeds within, between these two spaces. And they were, we can call them actually kind of the people's press. They produced a lot of material because they sat day in and day out and produced material both from the past, and then they created something from themselves. And I'm going to talk about now very briefly about two brothers, which became kind of the material for my first book in the book series, brothers from the Stranda commune, Halldór and Niels Jónsson. They were in a very poor peasant son, started to produce a lot of material. They both kept diary, one for 24 years before he passed very young. He died on the sea, on a boat. And the other one for 40 years. The collections of letters. I mean, they sent a lot of letters and they took copy of them and they kept the letters which they got. Love letters, which I found, I'm going to talk a little later. Collections of poetry. I mean, they collected poetry in big quantities. A list of material possessions, educational material, drawings, handwritten newspapers. So here are the two of the books. The first book in the book series, Bræður from af Ströndum, Brothers from the Stranda Commune, and then a monograph which I wrote in Icelandic. It came out in 1997. It's called in English, Education, Love and Grief, where I deal with actually the combination of education and then emotions. And that's part of this. If you are going to explain how this all came about, how these people were, why they started to read and write like they did, because Icelandic society was a very poor society with almost no infrastructure, no schools, no roads, no bridges, just turf houses and scattered around the coast, and people sitting there and kind of pouring out all kinds of material. We have to remember at the time, infant mortality in Iceland was approximately in the middle of the 19th century, 35%. So there were, let me take a story from a very well-known autobiography by Matthías Jochumsson. He tells the story in his autobiography that he was a guest in a house of a relative, and in 1 week they lost actually 4 children in the same week in what it was called the children's disease. And his second wife, he was married 3 times. The second wife, she was in the same commune and lost 6 brothers and sisters. So the historian asks, how do you deal with it? And I think how people dealt with it was that they really, really dived into poetry and abstract thinking. So you have poetry in Iceland where people collected poetry, they recited poetry because life had to go on, even though you lost a lot of children in the same week. You had to attend the sheep, you had to attend the livestock, you had to think about the children who were still alive. You couldn't really go in bed and just sleep for months and deal with your grief in that way. So women, for example, they recited constantly poetry which dealt with these emotions. When I was dealing with these 2 brothers, I came across a candy box in the manuscript department, which was full of love letters. And you see this one of them I wanted just to show you there. So everyday life in the 19th century, how did this create a class? Because this was a creative class. They were not only writing up stuff from past centuries, they were also creating something from themselves. How did it influence the general public in their daily affairs? That's a fair question, I think. So the idea of a foreign land became part of the culture, like we see in Jón the farmer. He is introducing kangaroos, which is, no little matter. The idea of an abstract thought became part of the daily life. And that's there I am referring to the poetry, reciting of poetry, fairly complex poetry often, where people are dealing with very abstract thoughts. And finally, the idea of a progress became part of their survival strategy. And you see that in the letter of the brothers, they are always thinking ahead. They are always trying to better than life because they realize there is something better than they actually have in their current situation. Let me now switch to microhistory and just go very quickly over classical conceptual framework of microhistory. Well, when I moved back to Iceland in 1994, and I started to work in the manuscript department, I saw all these fantastic sources which were stored there, and very few people had actually done anything with them. I realized very soon that I needed a methodology to deal with these complicated sources. As we know, all Egodocuments are very complicated sources. And I stumbled up on microhistory and started to dive into it. And my first book from 1997 was actually the first microhistorical analysis in Icelandic historical scholarship. So let me go very quickly through the main characteristics of microhistory. Source material and its subjectivity, just the fact that you accept the fact that sources are subjective to outside influences, and we celebrate the fact that they are written by live people who have their thoughts and beliefs pouring into the sources. On the periphery or normal exception, which is a fairly neat microhistorical concept to recognize the difference between those in power and those who are thrown into the court and judged by the people in power. You find out by reconstructing the sources that something which is done in one part of the society is condemned in another part of the society. And that's what we refer to as a normal exception. The reduction of the scale of observation is, of course, the name of the game in the microhistorical studies. You try to, instead of synthesis, a huge synthesis of big events or over centuries, for that matter, you focus on fairly limited event or limited local or limited place or an individual, which is kind of the characteristic of microhistory. And then when you have done your research on the small research topic, you try to connect it to contextualization, connect the big and the small research units. That's something which I am not very happy with, but that's another story. I'm not going to go into that. Just to give you a reference to a Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies from 2017, they did actually a fantastic special issue on microhistory, and you see there Tom Robichaud, the portrait is a Duke professor, and Tom Cohen, who is a professor emeritus at York University in Toronto. They actually came together, and Tom Cohen wrote a very provocative paper on microhistory, and they gathered people in workshop, people who were skeptics about microhistory and others who liked it, and they ended up publishing it, and the outcome was really, first of all, the micro perspective gives a great opportunity to look at the big picture. That was their argument. With the aid of narrative analysis, including critical evaluation of historical sources, microhistorians managed to get a new and fresh perspective on past history. That's something which, a lot of microhistorians would agree on this one. And the third one was they came to conclude that microhistory offers a new and exciting take on the globalization process. And that's something which I don't buy at all. I refer to it as far-reaching microhistory, local versus global. It is indeed very hard to reject the global phenomena. The global vision has had an impact on every individual in the local and rejects the conceptual framework of world and global history. I take the opposite approach. I apply microhistory to my subject with all the tools and the resources it offers, but with the consciousness that the subject I am addressing is indirectly part of a much larger context. For example, material culture. And I cherish three fundamental features of historical analysis: agency, subjectivity, and primary sources in globalized world. And just to make sure that if you global history, they can't really, or in very few instances, deal with agency. Subjectivity is not really an issue. And what they are dealing with mostly is people who travel between worlds, different cultural worlds, and that's kind of what they call the global history. I'm going to turn now to Egodocuments, and here we are talking about autobiographies, where the author is also the main character. semi-autobiographies, where someone other than the main character writes the book, and conversational books, where, for example, in Iceland, they had their high days in the middle of the 20th century when news media was growing, and journalists took, extensive interviews with people and published it in a book. And then you have, of course, diaries, personal letters, a response to questionnaires, scholarly questionnaires, scholarly interviews, official documents such as medical records, court records, parish records, all with material about individuals, and then digital material in general. You, of course, know about the international development. For a longest while, Egodocuments were not really in, especially when historical demography was really the name of the game. I was raised up in a department in Pittsburgh where historical demography was, really the thing, and people didn't really know anything about stuff like Egodocuments. But later, with postmodernism and the trample of the Eastern Bloc, and also capitalism in a way, groups started to step forward and tell their stories, and the scholarly world took them under their wing and started to talk. I have always been kind of hooked on Egodocuments from a very early age. When my father passed away, the year 2000, my mother sold the house they had lived in and I was raised up in, and I found actually 100 letters from myself to them between 1985 or 88, which was like a diary. Writing long letters where I was actually explaining to them what I was experiencing in a new country. And I remember my father was a very energetic letter writer, and so I went to my basement, picked up a box with a lot of, I hadn't really thrown anything away, and he had actually written 500 letters to me, one letter a week, more or less. I found old letters from past periods. I started to write a diary 1996, and I am now writing book number 78. So this is, I am a passionate diary writer. So all of this is kind of really part of my scholarship I have understood, I think, how important the act of writing is, how important it is for those who we are studying to actually sit down and write. The act of writing is just so important for people, and I would argue that you can't actually trust that kind of writing. Connections with the material world, of course, a diary is a book which you kind of cherish, and that's important in the Icelandic context where people didn't really own anything. The writer and the memory, what is remembered, and its meaning. I mean, that's a phenomena which I deal, for example, in my new book, which you see here. No, let me see. You see in the next slide, autobiographical traditions in Egodocuments, where I go into how people actually structure their memories when they go from one life stage to another. It's part of kind of the self-creation. Now, Egodocuments in Iceland from the late 19th century to 2004, there were approximately 1,100 autobiographies written during that time. And here you have the gender division. It's the man's world for sure. I mean, women didn't really write autobiographies, more semi-autobiographies. But in fact, this is mostly man's world. But women make up for it, and they're very energetic letter writers, and in poetry too. So the question is, what kind of phenomena Egodocuments in Iceland is? One would think, maybe it's an elite phenomena. You see Professor Bergsteinn Jónsson wrote a piece in Saga, Icelandic scholarly journal here in Iceland, 1987, where he looked at the life course of 611 MPs, and only 37 of them had got, their Egodocuments and were subjects of Egodocument, and that is kind of really amazing. And you see in my database, you see how I broke it down by classes, 120 farmers, 98 writers, pastors, fishermen, and so on. I tried to look at Egodocuments from the memory, the concept of memory. And it is actually quite interesting to see how collective memory, historical memory, how they played out in the Icelandic 19th century society. You have collective memory very weak in Iceland because of the structure of the landscape. I mean, there were farms scattered around the coast. There were absolutely no urban centers except Reykjavik, which was a very tiny one. But historical memory was fairly strong and was rising because of the independent movement. But we had also this saga tradition from the 11th and the 12th century, which had lived with the people, up to the 19th century. So people had some sense of, who they actually were. So you had collective memory weak, while historical memory was stronger. And this was the opposite in Europe, where you had collective memory strong around the village communities and historical memory fairly weak until the formation of the nation state. So this gave room for individual memory in Iceland. So people's memory is created in a different context which determines their meaning. And in fact, a lot of autobiographies written by people from the 19th century, they start by the author claiming that they didn't really do anything specific, very interesting, but they're still going to tell their stories. And that was because they had been reading the Icelandic sagas, which dealt with farmers in the 11th and the 12th century, people who were just basically like themselves. So I divided this autobiographical tradition in Iceland in the 20th century in two parts. It was the culture of testimony, where farmers stepped forward and told the story how they became neat citizens, how they stood behind the newly formed republic. They built up their houses, they enlarged their fields, they married, they had children, and so forth. Around 1980, you have a different cultural space, actually, which I called cultural confession, where people actually start to confess, all kinds of misdeeds in society. And these are part of the 12 steps programs, alcoholism, or whatever you can call it. And people get really into, their emotions. And so you have a shift in really what these literature actually tell us. And of course, there is a overlap between different forms of expression and experimentation. So escalation of self-expression, 6 stages, biographies from the basically 1500 to up to the 1900, very popular, mostly about great men, bishops, sheriffs and stuff like that. People really role models for the general public. And then the first autobiographies are formed in the late 19th century. That was the first state. Semi-autobiographies come in between the wars in the 20th century, and also conversational books, as I mentioned before. That's the second stage. And then the third stage is kind of in between, around the middle of the 20th century. You have autobiographies, semi-autobiographies, or conversational books, all very popular and become kind of part of the marketplace. They're one of the most popular books sold in the market. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have autofiction, where people are not really so keen on the truth. They use the self just to reflect on life in a very free and restricted way. And that's the fourth state. And the fifth state is what we are in now, perceptual sources, all the stuff we hear on the internet and stuff like that. So again, creative space. How can we explain all this out of production? Egodocuments. It is the culture of emotion. As I mentioned before, just the fact that people had to deal with grief through, find a way to deal with grief. Literature was one way of doing that, and that was important for them to actually learn to read and write. Lack of material goods. I mean, this was dirt poor society, and just to create a manuscript was you owned something then, and the memory process, as I mentioned before. So the hypothesis about the development of the self-expression, number one, traditional forms of Egodocuments is losing its status. I think there's absolutely no way around that. This progressive change had different effect on the sexes. There's also no denial of that. Much more women are expressing themselves in Egodocuments. This train of events, the deconstruction of the self, completely alters the position of history with respect to the past. It really affects how we are doing history. And that's the reason the network of Egodocument is as strong as it is, because we really sense the time we are living in. As the compartments that the individual memory, number 4, has relied on disintegrated, so the central existence on which the memory of the nation rests falls apart. It's a bold statement, actually, but, and here we are facing a complete disintegration of the self, or what? That's the big question. Thanks for listening. And these are manuscripts from Halldór and Niels. I hope I'm not, did I go over time?
No, I think it's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I think it was fascinating, interesting, and also the assumptions were very, well, to the point. I could agree with every one of them, I think, personally. So now let's see if anyone has any questions.
Absolutely.